History is written by the victors. But sometimes in order to win, they have to erase the very people who taught them how. Before Rome became legend, it learned everything from a superior civilization, the Etruscans. They were the ones who planted the seeds of Rome, from its fortified cities to its symbols of power. And in return, Rome wiped their name from human memory. The Etruscans didn't collapse. They were made to disappear. A silence that was perfectly staged, cold, calculated, and lasting 2,000 years. What made Rome so desperate to hide its own origins? What were they so afraid of in their former teachers? In today's episode of Bedtime History, we're not just uncovering a forgotten civilization. We're exposing a carefully orchestrated silence and searching for the truth behind one of the ancient world's greatest mysteries. When you brush off the dust of time from an ancient stone, the first thing that appears isn't an answer. It's a footprint. Faint, uncertain, yet undeniable. A trace that tells us someone walked this land long before Rome ever spoke its first word. A presence that history chose to forget. Those footprints stop in the misty plains of Tuscany, where gentle hills quietly hide nameless cities and wordless tombs. The Etruscans didn't arrive with the thunder of war chariots or the light of holy scriptures. They emerged like a shadow that already knew the land, as if they were simply returning to continue something left unfinished from a time older than history itself. Their origin is a riddle, a mystery scholars have debated for thousands of years with no final answer. And that mystery forms the first and deepest crack in the story of who they were. Herodotus, the Greek historian often called the father of history, offered a tale laced with myth. He claimed the Etruscans were once Lydians from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. After a long famine, their king decided to split the nation in half. One part stayed behind. The other, led by Prince Tyrannus, set sail westward in search of new land. They landed in Umbria, Italy, and from there built a new civilization. The Greeks called them the Tyrrhenians. The Romans would later call them the Etruscans. If that story is true, it would make them Eastern migrants, bringing a foreign legacy into the heart of Europe. But centuries later, another Greek historian living in Rome, Dionysius of Hyrcanus, strongly disagreed. After studying the Etruscan language, religion, and customs, he argued they had no connection to the Lydians at all. Their language resembled nothing else in the region. He concluded with confidence that the Etruscans didn't come from anywhere. They were native to Italy, an indigenous people who had evolved separately since prehistoric times with a culture like no other. This debate isn't just academic. It cuts to the heart of identity. If the Etruscans came from the east, they were outsiders on the European map. But if they were native, then why did their writing, beliefs, and social structures feel so alien? Even compared to neighboring Italic peoples, they seem like an anomaly, a cultural outlier in the flow of the peninsula's development. Unlike Roma, which had the legend of Romulus and Regius, the Etruscans left no clear origin story, no founding hero, no sacred ancestor. They arrived like a whisper impossible to trace to a single moment. There's a quiet discomfort whenever people speak of their beginnings. Because if they weren't from here, how did they understand the land so intimately? And if they were, why did they feel so foreign? This sense of not quite fitting in may be precisely why Roman history, in its need to craft a strong, clean identity, had to erase them. Nothing disturbs a rising empire more than the reminder that its foundations were laid by a people it couldn't fully explain or control. To Rome, the Etruscans were an unsolved equation. And in a world obsessed with order and logic, an unsolved equation is a threat. Maybe it was that very ambiguity, the cloud around their origins, that became their first sentence, long before the last Roman soldier ever marched across their final city. If those faint footprints across the soil of Italy marked the beginning of a mystery, then the first shape they carved into the land wasn't Rome. It was cities with walls curved and soft, like the worn lines on the forehead of someone who's seen too much. The story of Rome often begins with wolves, milk, and two abandoned brothers building an empire from faith and iron. But that's a legend, one crafted long after the truth had already happened. The truth is long before Romulus raised an axe to carve Rome's first boundary. Powerful Etruscan cities like Veii, Tarquinia, and Cerveteri were already standing tall, complete with underground drains, grand temples, and intricate rituals. Rome wasn't born out of emptiness. It was born in the shadow of a greater civilization. The Etruscans were the ones who planted the very idea of an organized city, of power expressed through symbols, of society functioning through rules, systems that Rome would later steal, reshape, and claim as its own. For the first centuries of Roman history, what we call the Kingdom period, everything that would later be considered Roman, was really just an ambitious copy of existing Etruscan structures. And that connection wasn't vague. It was carved into the very names of Rome's early kings. Legend says that 3 of Rome's first 7 kings, Tarquinius Priscus, Servius Tullius, whose mother was Etruscan, and Tarquinius Superbus were either of Etruscan blood or origin. They didn't just rule Rome. They shaped it. Tarquinius Priscus is credited with building the massive Cloaca Maxima drainage system, laying the groundwork for the Roman Forum, and beginning the construction of the Temple of Jupiter on Capitoline Hill. These weren't minor projects. They were the backbone of a future empire. But the Etruscan legacy wasn't just brick and stone. It flowed into every corner of Roman political and religious life. Architecture, the use of the arch, a design that made Rome's greatest structures possible, was already being mastered by the Etruscans in their city gates and tombs. Symbols of power. The ivory curule chair Celer Curalis, where Rome's highest-ranking officials sat, came directly from the ornate seats of Etruscan nobility. Even more important was the fasces, a bundle of rods tied around an axe, symbolizing the Roman state's power to rule and execute. That too came from Etruscan royal guards, the Lycas, who had carried it centuries earlier. Rituals. The Roman triumph, the most glorious parade a general could receive with chariots, purple robes, and divine honors, was likely a near replica of Etruscan ceremony. Even the sacred arts of reading omens, whether by inspecting an animal's liver haruspice, or watching the flight of birds, or were Etruscan in origin, taught by their priests long before Rome adopted them as state policy. But this wasn't an equal cultural exchange. This was the relationship between an original master and an ambitious student. The Etruscans handed Rome the toolkit to build an empire. But an empire can't survive on borrowed foundations. It must rewrite its own origin story. And to do that, it needs to erase the guiding hand that once led it from the shadows. Nothing makes a new ruler more uncomfortable than having to admit they once learned from someone else. So Rome, in its hunger to become the face of civilization, shed its old skin as if it had never worn it. The Etruscans weren't cast out of history because they were weak. They were removed because they were too strong, too distinct, too independent to be reduced to a footnote in the Roman epic. And so they disappeared. Not as a conquered enemy, but as a forgotten teacher. There's a simple, ruthless way to erase a civilization from collective memory. Make sure no one can understand their language. You don't need to destroy their buildings. You don't have to burn their art. All it takes is breaking the link between word and meaning. The Etruscans weren't wiped out in some great war. They weren't quietly assimilated like weaker cultures. For centuries, even as Rome grew stronger, the Etruscans still spoke their language. They still wrote it on coffins, on pottery, on sacred stone. But little by little, that voice faded, sinking beneath the soil of a forced silence. And by the time Rome was telling the world's story, the Etruscan tongue had become a sound without a translator, allowed to exist physically, yet stripped of its power to say anything at all. Etruscan is one of the greatest mysteries in historical linguistics. It's what scholars call a language isolate, meaning it doesn't belong to any known language family, not even the Indo-European family that gave birth to Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and most modern European languages. Etruscan stands alone, an island in a vast ocean of human speech. Its grammar, vocabulary, and phonetics have no close relatives. This deepens the mystery of who the Etruscans were and makes them feel like strangers, even to their closest neighbors. Today, we've collected over 13,000 Etruscan inscriptions. That might sound like a lot, but most of them are painfully short and repetitive. They're grave markings, names of the deceased, their parents, their age, or simple dedications on pottery like me. Kaliu. I belong to Kalu. We can read the letters since the Etruscans borrowed and modified the Greek alphabet. We can pronounce the words. But that's where it ends. What's truly shocking is the total absence of long complex texts. There's no epic like Homer Iliad, no philosophy like Plato's, no tragedies like those of Sophocles, and most of all, no historical chronicles like Livy's. Nothing structured remains. No text that tells their own story has survived. Even among the inscriptions we have, we only understand fragments. It has become a language cut off from memory, like a letter written in a code no one remembers how to break. But the real question isn't why don't we understand it? It's why can't we understand it anymore? Languages don't just vanish. They get pushed aside, outlawed, labeled as outdated, heretical, rebellious. During Rome's rise, when power demanded unity and control, the Etruscan language was slowly pushed out of public life, out of politics, out of rituals, out of education. It stopped being taught to the elite. Then it stopped being taught at all. No decree was needed. People understood. If you keep a language quiet long enough, an entire people will eventually forget how to pronounce their own name. The Romans may not have burned Etruscan books. Maybe those books were never written on something as fragile as papyrus. But they did something far more lasting. They rewrote the entire world in their own tongue. They carved stone in Latin. They praised their gods in Latin. They wrote laws, history, and poetry in a language the rest of the peninsula was forced to adopt. And once the world began orbiting around Latin, it became background noise, a memory no one could call by name. That was the first and most effective step in erasing an entire civilization. If the Etruscan language was made to fall silent, then the next question is, where did their knowledge go? Every time a great civilization collapses, we instinctively search for the remains of libraries like Egypt's Library of Alexandria or the clay archives of Mesopotamia. Because in our minds, knowledge must have a home, a physical form, pages filled with writing. But with the Etruscans, that question becomes even more unsettling. They left behind countless signs of a highly sophisticated culture. Art, architecture, metallurgy, astronomy. Yet nowhere is there a clear center where this knowledge was stored. No library, no schools, no archive. Does that absence mean they had no written literature? Not necessarily. Roman authors like Cicero mention an organized body of Etruscan knowledge known as the Discipliner Etrusa. It wasn't a single book, but a sacred collection of teachings that governed every aspect of life. It reportedly included 3 major sets of texts: the Libri Haruspicini, guides for reading omens from animal organs; the Libri Fulgurales on decoding the meaning of lightning; and the Libri Ritualis, a wide-ranging manual on rituals. From founding cities and building temples to organizing armies and interpreting signs in everyday life. Even the origin of this knowledge, according to Etruscan legend, is shrouded in mystery. One story tells of a farmer in Tarquinia plowing his field when a strange being rose from the furrow. Tages, a childlike figure with the wisdom of an old sage. He sang aloud the entire contents of the Discipliner to the astonished Ruscans, who then had their high priests, the Lucimones, carefully record and preserve it. So what happened to those sacred books? Why hasn't even a scrap survived? Perhaps they were written on materials like linen or thin wood that simply didn't endure. Time may have done the rest. One rare piece of evidence supporting this theory is the Liber Linteus Zagrebensis, the Zagreb linen book, the only surviving Etruscan text on linen. Ironically, it still exists today only because it was cut up and used as wrappings for an Egyptian mummy. And even that book, though it's the longest Etruscan text we have, appears to be just a ritual calendar. Still, the total disappearance of their knowledge base raises a deeper possibility. Maybe the Etruscan library wasn't stored in books at all. Maybe to them knowledge wasn't something to be mass-produced, but something to be experienced, witnessed, and felt firsthand. Perhaps their real library was hidden in other places in stone and soil. Their tombs were laid out like cities with murals depicting life and the afterlife. Stone books written in images. Each tomb was a chapter, each painting a passage describing their view of the universe, the design of a temple, the direction of a city gate. Everything was aligned to a cosmic logic. These were books not read with eyes but experienced by walking through them. In living ritual, knowledge passed from master to student through ceremony and action. The way a haruspex held an animal's liver, how he read its lines, how he looked to the sky. This was a living language impossible to fully record in writing. Once the chain of ritual transmission was broken, the living library collapsed with it. So when the Romans went searching for an Etruscan library, either to learn from it or destroy it, they may have found nothing they could burn. The knowledge was already embedded in stone, in space, in practice. It was a kind of wisdom that couldn't be translated, duplicated, or absorbed into Rome's new system. One that demanded everything be written, categorized, and controlled. And a form of knowledge that can't be controlled. That kind is always the first to be forgotten. If the Etruscan library lies underground, then nowhere is it more massive and more alive than in the cities of the dead. Ironically, what we know best about how the Etruscans lived comes from how they prepared for death. Their most intact and abundant legacies aren't palaces, fortresses, or temples, but tomb complexes, or more accurately, necropolises, cities of the dead. But to call them merely tombs doesn't quite do them justice. These weren't burial chambers in the ordinary sense. They were fully realized stone homes complete with roofs, columns, hallways, domestic furnishings, and murals so vivid that the line between the living and the afterlife feels almost erased. Take Cervati, home to the Bandizia necropolis, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This wasn't a cemetery. It was a real city for the departed. There were planned streets, tiny public squares, and hundreds of mound-shaped tumuli that looked like rounded houses, each one belonging to a family across generations. Inside, craftsmen carved the soft volcanic rock tuff to recreate exact replicas of Etruscan homes. Multiple rooms, stone beds, chairs, columns, even daily objects etched into the walls. The dead weren't simply buried. They were given an entire world carefully reconstructed as if life didn't end, but simply continued in another realm, parallel and uninterrupted. But to truly feel the soul of the Etruscans, you have to go to Tarquinia and step inside the tombs painted with murals. Here on the damp walls of eternal darkness, art bursts forth with breathtaking life. Unlike the formal ceremonial art of Egypt or the myth-heavy idealized beauty of Greece, Etruscan art is a joyful shout celebrating the moment. You won't see gods judging souls or spirits in torment. Instead, you see in the tomb of the leopards, Tomba dei Leopard, a grand banquet is underway. Noble men and women recline on elegant couches, dining and chatting together. Musicians play double flutes. Lyres are strummed, and the atmosphere radiates joy, intimacy, and a striking sense of gender equality. In the tomb of hunting and fishing Tombella Pesca, the energy is kinetic. A young man dives from a cliff into blue water, perhaps a metaphorical leap into the afterlife. Others fish from boats as birds soar above. It's a tribute to nature's beauty and the simple thrill of physical experience. In the tomb of the Orgasuri, we see more complex funeral rituals. Figures appear to mourn, but there are also games and wrestling matches. A masked figure named Fursu appears, seemingly orchestrating a violent spectacle. This suggests that the Etruscan worldview held darker corners, rituals, and beliefs we still don't fully grasp. Their attention to death, paradoxically, reveals the most about how they lived. Unlike Rome, where death was often tied to military glory or political legacy, the Etruscans seemed to view death as a natural, gentle extension of life. They didn't glorify sacrifice. They illustrated preparation. They didn't promise heaven. They built a place where the dead could continue living as they always had, surrounded by color, sound, and sacred rhythm. And that unsettled Roman historians. In a world where death was supposed to be solemn, instructive, moralizing, the Etruscan tombs represented something dangerously subversive. The freedom to remember in your own way. The freedom to carry on without judgment. What couldn't be controlled wasn't written down. It was silenced or distorted. So when we step into those tombs today, we're not just exploring the past. We're listening to voices that were never allowed to speak in the world of the living. If the murals inside the tombs show us how the Etruscans lived, then their sculptures and artifacts reveal who they truly were. When language falls silent, and books are nowhere to be found, art becomes the last voice still speaking. And in Etruscan civilization, art wasn't mere decoration. It was memory given form. In every terracotta statue, every polished bronze mirror, every jet-black piece of Bucchero pottery, we don't just see technique. We see a soul that refuses to be forgotten, that won't let itself be reshaped by the victor's narrative. Unlike Greek art, which aimed for ideal proportions, symmetry and turning humans into gods or Roman art. Practical and rigid, used to chisel the stern portraits of emperors and senators. Etruscan art breathes with spontaneity, warmth, and emotional expression. It doesn't distance itself from the viewer. It draws you in. The figures are real people with glances, gestures, and emotions that feel both deeply human and strangely unfamiliar. Look at some of their masterpieces. The sarcophagus of the spouses. Perhaps no work captures the Etruscan spirit more fully than this terracotta coffin. A husband and wife recline together on a banquet couch. Not as mourners, not sanctified, but very much alive. He gently wraps an arm around her shoulders. She seems ready to pour perfume into his open hand. They both gaze forward toward the viewer with that enigmatic smile. The so-called archaic smile. But here, it's more than an artistic convention. It's a quiet statement of contentment. A serene defiance in the face of eternity. This sculpture is a declaration of love, of equality, and of the idea that human connection doesn't end with death. It endures. The Apollo of Veii. This life-size terracotta statue once stood atop a temple, part of a mythological tableau. But unlike the stiff, still Kouros statues of contemporary Greece, this Apollo strides forward with dynamic energy. His body is alive with movement, cloak billowing behind him, and his broad smile beams with radiant vitality. He's not a remote abstract deity. He's an active force of nature, a divine presence in motion. The Chimera of Ferezzo. This bronze masterpiece reveals a darker, more intense facet of Etruscan artistry. The mythological beast. Lion's body. Goat's head rising from its back. Serpent tail. Is captured mid-agony. Struck down by the hero Bellerophon. Every muscle strains in pain. The lion's mouth roars with fury. The goat's head collapses in death. The artist didn't just depict a monster. They captured a raw moment of suffering and tragic finality. This wasn't just myth. It was the full emotional range of existence, from joy to grief, rendered in metal. Etruscan art wasn't reserved for temples or tombs. It was through everyday life. The gleaming black Booker pottery, created through a special firing method that turned the clay jet black inside and out, was used not only in funerals but in banquets and rituals. Bronze mirrors, often beautifully engraved on the back with mythological scenes, were part of noble women's daily routines. And maybe that's what made Etruscan art so incompatible with Roman ideals. It didn't glorify military triumph. It didn't worship empire or order. It celebrated the everyday with a depth that made you stop and truly look. That empathy, that human intimacy, is what made it timeless, and also why it couldn't be allowed to survive in a world built on control, hierarchy, and submission. Roman historians would later reduce all of it to a libellary decoration, a deliberate diminishment, an attempt to mute the voice of a civilization that dared to believe more in the dignity of the human experience than in the machinery of power. Perhaps nothing baffled and even enraged Greek and Roman historians more than the role of women in Etruscan society. In an ancient world built on patriarchal order, where Greek women were confined to the home and Roman women were praised for silence and submission, the Etruscan woman stood out as a startling exception. She wasn't a quiet shadow behind a man. She was a living, independent force with status, voice, and a level of freedom that deeply unsettled the societies around her. The evidence for this unique position isn't hidden. It's right there in art, in inscriptions, in everyday objects, public presence, as seen in tomb paintings. Etruscan women shared the banquet couch with their husbands, drinking, conversing, enjoying music side by side. For a Greek observer, this was scandalous. In Athens, only courtesans were allowed at such gatherings. Respectable wives would never appear in such public festive settings. Naming rights on thousands of epitaphs. Etruscan women are recorded by their own names, not simply as wife of or daughter of a man. Even more strikingly, Etruscan naming conventions often included the mother's name metronymic, suggesting maternal lineage played a significant role in defining identity. A direct challenge to Rome's strictly patrilineal structure. Property and literacy. Artifacts such as engraved bronze mirrors and jewelry boxes often bear the names of female owners, indicating personal property rights. Many images on pottery and mirrors show women reading or holding scrolls, suggesting they were literate and educated. This freedom didn't go unnoticed. It became the target of mockery and condemnation from foreign writers. The Greek historian Theophilus, writing in the 4th century BCE, infamously described Etruscan women in scandalous terms, likely exaggerated or biased. He claimed they take great care of their bodies and show them off without shame. They dine not only with their husbands but with any man present. They are heavy drinkers and very beautiful. He went so far as to say that Etruscan women raise children without knowing who the fathers are. For centuries, this passage has been used as proof of Etruscan decadence and immorality. But with modern perspective, it reads differently. It isn't objective reporting. It's cultural shock. Theophilus and his peers were viewing a fundamentally different society through the lens of their own patriarchal norms. What they saw as shameless might have been confidence. What they condemned as promiscuity might have been social freedom. The real power of Etruscan women didn't lie in how they dressed or dined, but in their right to exist visibly, publicly, equally, and in a Roman world built on absolute control, where the family itself was a microcosm of empire ruled by the iron hand of the Peta families. A society where women didn't stay behind the curtain was not just unusual, it was an ideological threat. It didn't challenge Rome's army or its laws. It challenged its concept of order and power. And so in rewriting history, Roman authors turned the Etruscan woman into a symbol of disorder, deviance, a cautionary tale justifying conquest. Rome, they claimed, brought civilization in order to a wild, unruly people. But in truth, erasing Etruria also meant erasing an alternate vision of what society and womanhood could be. History didn't just bury their cities. It buried a model of gender equality that the Western world would not even begin to reconsider for another 2,000 years. If Etruscan society unsettled the Romans with the freedom of its women, then their spiritual world left the Romans both awake and deeply uneasy. Etruscan religion bore little resemblance to any belief system surrounding it. There were no wild myths of passionate gods and feuding deities like those at top Mount Olympus. Their religion wasn't a mythology to be told. It was a science to be practiced. A complex, solemn discipline focused on deciphering the will of the gods written into every detail of the universe. To the Etruscans, the cosmos was sacred, ordered, and filled with messages. The sky was divided into 16 houses, each the domain of one or more gods. Every event in nature, thunder, a bird's flight, the shape of a sacrificial animal's liver, was believed to be a sign sent from a specific divine house. Humans couldn't change fate, but they could learn to read these signals in order to prepare and act wisely. This entire system of knowledge was preserved in their sacred corpus, known as the Disciplina Etrusca. To interpret these divine signs, the Etruscans developed remarkably sophisticated divination methods, and their priests were among the most respected figures in society. Haruspici, Divination by liver. Perhaps their most iconic practice. After sacrificing a sheep, a priest called a haruspex would examine its liver with great care. The liver was seen as a microcosm of the universe. One extraordinary archaeological find. The liver of Piacenza is a bronze model of a liver divided into sections, each inscribed with the name of a deity. By analyzing unusual shapes, discoloration or markings on the real liver, and comparing them to this cosmic map, the haruspex could interpret the god's intentions. Augury bird divination. Priests known as augurs would watch birds within a sacred space, observing their flight paths, calls, numbers, and species. Each detail carried meaning, signaling omens of good or ill. This practice would later become deeply embedded in Roman public ritual. Brontoscopy. Lightning divination. This was seen as the most direct and powerful form of divine communication, especially from the supreme god Tania, akin to Jupiter or Zeus. The Etruscans believed Tania could hurl different types of lightning from different regions of the sky, each with its own specific message. Decoding these messages required knowing the time of day, the season, and the exact location in the sky where the lightning appeared. It was a demanding and precise spiritual science. In this worldview, deities like Tina, Uni, the supreme goddess akin to Juno, and Menva, goddess of wisdom akin to Minerva, were not figures to bargain with. They were vast, distant forces operating under strict cosmic laws. Humans didn't beg for favors. They listened for instructions. The priest wasn't a miracle worker but a scholar, a gifted translator between the divine and the human. The Romans were undeniably fascinated by this system. They adopted many Etruscan divination practices, and Etruscan haruspices continued to be revered in Rome well into the imperial era. Yet at their core, the two worldviews could never fully align. The Romans, with their practical mindset and obsession with dominion, could not accept a universe where fate was fixed and unchangeable. Over time, Roman gods became more human, more political, supporters of state power, sponsors of conquest. Meanwhile, the Etruscan gods remained distant, mysterious, and uncompromising, keepers of a cosmic order that humans could observe but never alter. This profound difference in how each civilization viewed the divine-human relationship became one of the great divides between their cultures. One empire sought control, the other understanding. One built altars to affirm power, the other read the sky for quiet instruction. And in that silence between thunderclaps and bird cries lay a chasm too wide for the two to ever truly bridge. When we think of the great empires of the ancient world, we often imagine a single seat of power, a glorious capital where all roads lead. Athens in Greece, Babylon in Mesopotamia, and of course, Rome itself. Entire imperial structures were built around one political, military, and cultural core. But once again, the Etruscans defied that model. They created a flourishing civilization without a capital city, without a supreme ruler, and without ever founding an empire in their own name. Instead, the Etruscans existed as a network of powerful independent city-states, known as the Etruscan League, or the Dodecapus. The League of 12 cities. Cities like Tyrannia, Vulci, Seviteri, Clusium, and others were each self-governed mini-states. They had their own governments, their own armies, and often distinct artistic styles and customs. Their unity wasn't dictated from above. It was a loose alliance rooted in shared language, religion, and economic interests. Once a year, Representatives from these city-states would gather at a sacred site known as Fanum Voltum, the sanctuary of the god Voltumla. The exact location of this site remains an archaeological mystery, but ancient sources describe it as a place of major religious festivals and important intercity discussions. There they would elect a high priest or ceremonial king with a one-year term. Yet, this figure held mostly symbolic and religious authority, not centralized political or military control. This decentralized model had clear advantages. It allowed an incredible diversity of culture to bloom. Each city became a hub of creativity, competing in wealth, innovation, and artistic finesse. That's why Etruscan pottery, sculpture, and tomb architecture varies so dramatically from city to city. It also fostered a dynamic adaptive society, one where power wasn't concentrated in the hands of a single ruling class. But this same model proved to be their Achilles heel when faced with a fundamentally different kind of force. Rome, in stark contrast, was built on centralization and iron discipline. It had a singular goal and pursued it relentlessly: conquest. The Etruscan city-states, with their long histories of rivalry and occasional conflict, were never able to forge a truly unified and sustained military front. They could form temporary alliances in the face of common threats, but those alliances often fell apart once the danger passed or local interests took precedence. Rome exploited this vulnerability with surgical precision. It never needed to face the full strength of Etruria all at once. Instead, it used a divide-and-conquer strategy, focusing on one city at a time. The decadal-long siege and eventual destruction of Veii, ending around 396 BCE, is a textbook example. While Veii fought desperately, other Etruscan cities hesitated or failed to intervene with enough force or urgency. When Veii fell, Rome didn't just gain fertile territory. It sent a message. Etruscan unity was an illusion. So the fall of the Etruscans wasn't just a military defeat. It was the collapse of a political model. A multi-entered world that valued local autonomy couldn't stand against the relentless force of a centralized state engineered for war and expansion. The Etruscans may not have wanted an empire. Perhaps they didn't even believe in the idea of absolute power. But tragically, it was that very lack of imperial ambition that made them easy prey for one. In the end, a civilization that didn't need to conquer was conquered and consumed by one that did. The silence Rome reserved for the Etruscans was not the indifference of strangers. It was the heavy guarded silence of a child who refuses to speak of their parents after an irreparable falling out. The deepest link and the deepest wound between these two civilizations wasn't forged on the battlefield. It was etched into the very walls of Rome, carved into the throne itself. It was the era of the Etruscan kings. According to tradition, Rome was ruled by 7 kings before it became a republic. And remarkably, the final and most influential of those kings came from Etruscan blood. The Tarquin dynasty. Their story, as told by the historian Livy, reads like an epic of ambition, enlightenment, and ultimately betrayal. The dynasty began with Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, a wealthy and capable man from the Etruscan city of Tarquinia, believing his homeland offered too few opportunities for advancement. He and his intelligent wife Tanquil moved to Rome, a young city brimming with potential. Legend tells that as they approached the city, an eagle swooped down, snatched Tarquin's hat, flew into the sky, and gently placed it back on his head. Tanquil, skilled in reading omens, interpreted the sign as a mark of destiny. With his wealth, talent, and the refined influence of Etruscan culture, Tarquinius quickly won the favor of the people and the Roman king, eventually ascending to the throne himself. He is credited with transforming Rome from a village into a true city, laying down infrastructure that would form its foundation. The last king of Rome was his descendant, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud. He ruled as a tyrant, trampling Roman traditions and instilling fear in the nobility. Tensions built, waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of a personal tragedy that would become the founding myth of the Roman Republic: the rape of Lucretia. The story takes place during a military campaign. A group of young officers, including Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, were drinking and debating whose wife was the most virtuous. They decided to ride back to Rome unannounced and find out. While most of the wives were wrong, they found Lucretia, the wife of the nobleman Collatinus, quietly spinning wool with her maids. Her beauty and virtue struck Sextus with the dark obsession. A few days later, Sextus returned to her home alone, welcomed as a guest. He waited until nightfall and crept into her room. Drawing his sword, he threatened her. But Lucretia, unafraid of death, refused to give in. Then Sextus made a crueler threat. He would kill her and a male servant, place their bodies together, and claim he had caught her committing adultery. For a Roman noblewoman, honor was more sacred than life. Faced with the threat of eternal disgrace, she yielded. The next day, Lucretia summoned her father and husband. She told them everything, made them swear vengeance, then drew a hidden dagger from her robe and took her own life. Her death ignited a revolution. A relative of the king, Lucius Junius Brutus, who had feigned madness for years to survive under tyranny, seized the moment. He carried Lucretia's bloodied body into the Roman Forum, gave a fiery speech, and stirred the people's fury. The Roman citizens rose up, expelled Tarquin the Proud and his entire family, and vowed never again to be ruled by a king. Thus, the Roman Republic was born, traditionally dated to 509 BC. But this was more than a political shift. It was a psychological severing. The cruelty of the Etruscan king and the crime of his son became symbols of everything Rome wished to purge from itself. In order to be free to become pure, Rome believed it had to eliminate not just the monarchy, but its entire legacy. The story of Lucretia became the moral justification for centuries of conflict, and the ideological cornerstone for erasing Etruscan memory from Roman identity. The betrayal was complete. The student had turned on the teacher. The birth of a republic does not automatically give rise to an identity. After expelling their last king, Rome found itself in a profound existential crisis. They had defined themselves by what they were not. No kings, no tyranny, no more Tarquins. But now came the harder question: who are we? And when they looked around their city, the answer was both ironic and unsettling. They were still, in many ways, an Etruscan city. The shadow of their cast-off teacher loomed everywhere, a constant reminder of a debt they couldn't deny. Senators met in a curé built in Etruscan architectural style. They walked paved roads and used drainage systems designed by Etruscan engineers. Their priests continued performing divination rituals inherited from Etruscan tradition to decide matters of state. Even the highest symbol of power in the young republic, the fasces, the bundle of rods and axe, was borrowed straight from the kings they had just overthrown. Rome was like an adopted child who had rebelled against their parents, but still lived in their house, wore their clothes, and spoke with their voice. This contradiction created an unbearable psychological tension. To truly become Roman, they couldn't simply ignore the past. They had to confront it and rewrite it. Rome needed an enemy and other to act as a mirror, a contrast through which to define itself. And there was no better enemy than the very civilization that had once shaped it. This process of enmity played out systematically across ideological fronts from excellence to decadence. The Etruscan culture, once admired for its refinement and wealth, was rebranded as a symbol of moral decay, indulgence, and weakness. The freedom of Etruscan women was ridiculed as promiscuity. Their grand feasts were described as orgies. Their vibrant heart was dismissed as lacking Roman seriousness and virtue. From teacher to tyrant, the memory of the Tarquin kings was deliberately darkened. No longer remembered as builders and modernizers of Rome, they became synonymous with cruelty and despotism. Their Etruscan origins were emphasized as the very root of their foreignness and brutality, traits incompatible with the so-called Roman spirit. From neighbor to threat, the Etruscan city-states to the north were no longer trade partners or former allies, but portrayed as a constant danger to Roman liberty. Any support they offered to help the Tarquin family reclaim the throne, like the legendary conflict with King Lars Porsena of Cusium, was twisted into proof that Etruscans were inherently hostile to Roman freedom. In parallel with vilifying the Etruscans, Rome worked tirelessly to construct a pure native origin myth of its own. The story of Romulus and Remus suckled by a she-wolf began to rise in prominence. It emphasized a divine homegrown beginning, untouched by Etruscan influence. It was a conscious effort to sever the cultural umbilical cord. Thus, the war Rome would soon wage against the Etruscans was not merely about territory. It was a battle for identity. Rome had to destroy the Etruscans on the battlefield to convince itself and the world that it had truly outgrown and broken away from its former master. The physical erasure had to follow the ideological one. The enormous cultural debt that Rome had borrowed wouldn't be paid with gratitude. It would be paid with oblivion. The conquest of the Etruscan city-states then was not just imperial ambition. It was a bitter, violent act of self-defense. When a civilization is forgotten, we often blame time as if forgetting was some natural erosion. But in the case of the Etruscans, the fading wasn't passive. It was deliberate. Erasure didn't begin with firebombs or instant conquest. It began with rewriting. Once history had been rewritten, once the enemy had been clearly named, military action became the next logical step. Rome's war against the Etruscans wasn't a grand, sweeping invasion. It was a slow, ruthless dismantling stretched across centuries. A grinding conquest, one city at a time. And no fall was more symbolic or more fateful than the fall of Veii. Veii was no ordinary city-state. It was the most powerful, wealthy, and strategically located of all the Etruscan cities, just 16 kilometers north of Rome across the Tiber River. For centuries, Veii had been both a fierce rival and a thorn in Rome's side. The two cities had clashed repeatedly over control of fertile land and key trade routes along the river. For Rome, Veii was more than a military opponent. It was a mirror of the prosperity they envied and the greatest obstacle to their northern expansion. As long as Veii stood, Rome would never fully control its own destiny. According to the historian Livy, the final war began around 406 B.C. and lasted for 10 grueling years. A siege so prolonged it was often compared to the Greek war against Troy. Rome committed itself completely. For the first time, Roman legions were forced to fight through winter, an enormous shift from the seasonal campaigns of the past. The war pushed the young republic to its limits. Commanding Rome's forces was Marcus Furius Camillus, one of the most legendary and controversial figures of the early Republic. After years of failed attempts to breach Veil's defenses, Camillus realized brute force wasn't enough. The city's walls were too strong. Instead, he chose a daring and unexpected tactic, one that ironically reflected the very engineering sophistication Rome had inherited from the Etruscans. Rather than batter the gates, Roman troops dug a tunnel beneath the city. Livy recounts the moment with dramatic flair. As the tunnel reached the foundations of the temple of the goddess Unijuno inside Veii, the Etruscan king was performing a sacrificial ritual. The high priest declared that whoever offered the entrails of the animal would be granted victory. At that precise moment, Roman soldiers burst through the temple floor, seized the offering, and presented it to Camillus. Simultaneously, Roman forces launched an all-out assault from outside the walls. Caught between two fronts above and below, Veii collapsed. The fall of Vision 396 BCE marked a turning point in Roman history. For the first time, Rome had completely annihilated a major rival and absorbed its territory. The fertile land of Veii was divided among Roman citizens, easing internal tensions and strengthening the Republic's economy. But more importantly, the victory gave Rome confidence, momentum for the next phase of its expansion. For the Etruscans, the fall of Veii was a catastrophe and a chilling warning. It exposed the fragility of their alliance system. Over 10 years of siege, none of the other Etruscan city-states managed or even tried to launch a coordinated rescue. Now they faced a Rome that was bolder, stronger, and no longer restrained by its most dangerous northern rival. The physical erasure had begun. Piece by piece, the Etruscan world was being dismantled. A missed opportunity never returns. After rising from the ashes of the GIC invasion, Rome was no longer a fragile republic clawing to survive. It had become something else entirely. A force forged in fire, hardened by humiliation, and now bound by an iron resolve never to appear weak again. And now its gaze turned back to the north, not as a rival seeking equilibrium, but as a conqueror chosen by fate. Etura, once a world of proud independent city-states, was no longer a peer. It was a target. The end of Etruscan independence did not come through a single decisive battle, but through a slow tightening, a prolonged dismantling that stretched across nearly a century. With military precision and shrewd diplomacy, Rome began to disassemble the Etruscan League one city at a time. The campaign began with the southernmost cities, those closest to Rome, Tarquinia and Falerii. These cities had long histories of conflict with Rome and put up fierce resistance. But they were no longer fighting the Rome of old. Now the legions were better organized, more disciplined, and driven by an unshakable will to conquer. After a series of bloody confrontations, Tarquinia and its neighbors were forced into harsh peace treaties, losing territory and all foreign policy autonomy. Servitary K. This city's fate illustrates Rome's strategic brilliance. Because Caere had remained neutral or even aided Rome during the GIC crisis, it was initially treated with unusual leniency. Its citizens were granted a special form of Roman citizenship without voting rights. Civitas Cinereo. It was a masterstroke. Rome used not just the sword but the illusion of privilege to divide its enemies. By rewarding one city, it weakened the collective resolve of the rest. Still, this favor was temporary. Eventually, Ker too would be absorbed completely. With the south pacified, Rome moved deeper into the Etruscan heartland, finally recognizing the existential threat. The northern cities made a last desperate effort to unify. A broad coalition of Etruscan cities formed, culminating in one last stand against Rome at the Battle of Lake Vatiman in 310 B.C. It would be one of the most tragic chapters in Etruscan history. The Etruscans fought with all the courage of a people trying to defend not just their land but their very identity. But courage wasn't enough. The Roman legions with superior discipline and battlefield tactics crushed the coalition. That single defeat shattered the military backbone of Etruscan resistance. Rome wasted no time securing its hold with calculated efficiency. Founding colonies. Colonia Rome established colonies of Roman citizens and Latin allies on strategically important Etruscan lands. These colonies served as military outposts and cultural outposts spreading Latin language. Law and lifestyle. Building roads. Military roads like the Via Raetia cut through Etruscan territory, enabling swift troop movements to quell rebellion and knitting the new provinces tightly into the Roman core. Imposing treaties defeated cities were forced into so-called alliances with Rome. These alliances stripped them of real sovereignty. They could no longer wage independent diplomacy, and they were obligated to provide soldiers for Rome's wars. By the mid-3rd century B.C., the military conquest was complete. Every Etruscan city-state had been brought under Roman rule. The sword had done its work. Political independence was over. But the fall of a people does not end on the battlefield. What came next was more insidious. The slow erasure of a culture. The war of weapons had ended. The war of memory was just beginning. History rarely moves in a straight line. Just as Rome basked in the triumph of Vi, confident, ascendant, and casting its gaze northward like a young conqueror, a disaster struck from an entirely unexpected direction. A new force, wild and terrifying, came pouring down from the Alps. They were the Gauls, fierce Celtic tribes, and they delivered a blow so devastating that it haunted Roman memory for centuries. Around 390 B.C., a Gaulish army led by the chieftain Brennus entered the Italian peninsula. Their initial intent may have been simple: raiding, perhaps seeking new land. After defeating an Etruscan force, they laid siege to Clusium, an Etruscan city-state. Clusium called on its old ally Rome for help. Rome sent envoys to negotiate. But not only did the talks fail, the Roman envoys violated diplomatic law by taking up arms against the Gauls in battle. Outraged by this breach, Brennus bypassed Clusium entirely and turned his fury toward Rome. Rome's legions marched out to meet them at the Allia River, a small tributary of the Tiber. The Battle of the Allia was one of the most humiliating defeats in Roman military history. The Roman soldiers, disciplined but inexperienced with the chaotic ferocity of Celtic warfare, were shattered by the Gauls' explosive assault and blood-curdling war cries. The army collapsed. The road to Rome lay wide open. The city fell with terrifying speed. Except for a small garrison of defenders and senators who fortified themselves on the Capitoline Hill. Rome was sacked and burned. Most buildings were destroyed. Archives were wiped out. After 7 months of occupation, the Gauls finally agreed to withdraw for a massive ransom, $000 of gold. According to legend, when the Romans protested that the Gauls' scales were rigged, Brennus threw his sword onto the scales and uttered the immortal words, "Vives! Woe to the vanquished!" It was a moment of pure humiliation. But it also created a golden opportunity for the Etruscans. Their greatest enemy had been humbled, disgraced, and drained. If there was ever a time to strike back, to reclaim lost cities, or even to erase Rome entirely, it was now. But it didn't happen. Once again, the Etruscans' fatal flaw resurfaced: disunity. rather than a coordinated counterattack. Only a few southern cities like Tarquinia launched scattered raids. The northern cities, less affected by Rome's expansion and more concerned with the Gauls pressing into their own territory, remained passive. They failed to see it for what it was, their final chance. Rome astonishingly recovered from the ashes of disaster. It rebuilt with greater determination. The trauma of the sack became fuel. They fortified the city with massive new walls. The Servian War. They restructured the army, learning from failure to become more adaptive and efficient. The ever-present fear of another invasion hardened Rome's foreign policy into something new. If Rome was to be safe, it had to control all of Italy. The Etruscans had missed their moment. They had underestimated Rome's will to survive. When Rome rose again, it was stronger, more ruthless, and driven by vengeance. The conquest of Etruria was no longer just about territory. It was about reasserting Rome's dominance, about making sure it would never again be humiliated. And now, one by one, each Etruscan city would face a Rome reborn in fire. This time, there would be no hesitation and no mercy. The most effective conquests aren't those that destroy a people physically, but those that make them forget who they were. After the sword was sheathed, Rome launched a different kind of conquest. Quieter, slower, but far more devastating. The cultural conquest, or what we now call Romanization. It wasn't done through violence, but through gradual erosion. A transformation so subtle it took generations until the word Etruscan no longer referred to a living people, but to archaeological remains. This process unfolded across every facet of life. Administrative and legal domination. The independent political systems of Etruscan city-states were dismantled. Traditional offices like Zilith or Lucumo disappeared, replaced by Rome's municipal government structure. Roman law replaced local customs. Latin became the language of courts, contracts, and commerce. To survive and thrive in this new order, the Etruscan elite had no choice but to learn and use Latin. Demographic and economic shifts. The founding of Roman colonies brought tens of thousands of Latin-speaking settlers directly into the heart of Etruria. This didn't just shift the demographic balance. It reshaped the economic and social landscape. The Romans introduced new agricultural methods, commercial models, and trade networks. It and noble families seeking to protect their status and wealth adapted. They sent their children to Roman schools, married into Roman families, and slowly merged into the elite of the empire. In doing so, they became agents of their own cultural fading. Pragmatic choice, but a deeply tragic one. The disappearance of language and religion. With Etruscan no longer spoken in public life, the language retreated to private spaces, spoken only by the elderly in whispers of memory until it too fell silent. Religious rituals, though some, like herpacy, were preserved for their usefulness, were gradually absorbed into the Roman state cult. The old gods were forgotten as temples to Greco-Roman deities rose across Etruria. The divine language of the Etruscans, once read in thunder, birds, and livers, was muted. The final blows to Etruscan identity came through two seismic political events in the late Republic. The Social War 91 to 88 BCE. Cities across Italy, including Etruscan ones, rose up demanding full Roman citizenship. After a bloody conflict, Rome conceded granting citizenship to all free inhabitants of the peninsula. In theory, it was equality. In reality, it erased local identities. Etruscan and Samnite became geographic labels. not cultural or political ones. Everyone was now Roman. Sulla's civil war. Shortly after, during the brutal civil war between Marius and Sulla, many Etruscan cities backed the wrong side Marius. When Sulla triumphed in 82 BCE, he unleashed savage retribution. Cities like Volterra, Chiusi, and Arezzo were heavily punished. Land was confiscated. Nobles were executed or exiled. This purge shattered the last pillars of the Etruscan aristocracy, those who had still preserved remnants of their heritage. By the early empire under Augustus, Romanization was complete. The Etruscans no longer existed as a distinct people. They were not wiped out by genocide. They were absorbed entirely. They became Romans. And when the last person to speak the ancient language passed away, the silence became total. History from that point on belonged to the victors. By the time the Roman Empire stood at the height of its power, its borders stretching from Britain to Egypt, the name Etruscan no longer conjured images of enemies or rivals. They had become something else entirely. A ghost in memory. An echo from a distant past. A curiosity for scholars and nostalgic minds. No longer a threat. They were now a mystery. In the imperial era, when the Etruscan language had already fallen completely silent in everyday life, a few Roman intellectuals began to look back on their legacy with a peculiar interest. Emperor Claudius and the Lost History. Perhaps the most remarkable figure in this rediscovery was none other than a Roman Emperor Claudius who reigned from 41 to 54 CE. Before his rise to power, Claudius was a serious scholar, and he harbored a deep fascination with the Etruscans, possibly influenced by his first wife who came from Etruscan aristocracy. He dedicated years to studying and writing a comprehensive 20-volume history of the Etruscans titled Tyrannica. He even compiled an Etruscan Latin dictionary, an invaluable tool that might have unlocked the secrets of the lost language. This is one of the great tragedies of historical scholarship. Had Claudius's work survived, we might have known everything. Etruscan history, mythology, social structure told by someone who had access to Rome's last remaining sources. But the entire project vanished. Not a single full copy remains. Not even a meaningful excerpt. Its disappearance has become the ultimate symbol of Etruscan erasure. The last door into their world was slammed shut and locked forever. The survival of rituals. Though the culture died, some of the Etruscans' most powerful rituals endured, though now tamed and repurposed under Roman authority. The haruspices, priests who read omens in animal entrails, remained part of the official Roman state religious apparatus. Even emperors in times of crisis summoned them to divine the will of the gods. Remarkably, as late as 408 CE, when the Visigoths were besieging Rome, sources record that haruspices were still being called upon to perform ancient rites in a desperate attempt to save the city. In the imperial imagination, the Etruscans became a caricature. They were remembered as a deeply religious, fate-obsessed people tangled in rituals and omens. At the same time, they were also mocked. Roman poet Culus famously coined the term obesus Etruscus, the fat Etruscan, a jab that painted them as lazy, indulgent, and soft. This was a powerful way to control the narrative, acknowledge the Etruscans' religious legacy, but diminish them culturally, reinforcing Roman virtues of discipline, labor, and martial courage. And so in the imperial era, the Etruscans had become what one might call a ghost in the Roman machine. A flicker of memory summoned during rituals. A subject for scholarly debate. But stripped of their once vibrant soul. The final act of possession was complete. Rome now owned not only Etruscan land and symbols, but also the exclusive right to tell their story in whatever version suited the victor. When the Roman Empire stood at its zenith, its dominion stretching from Britain to Egypt, the name Etruscan no longer evoked the image of an enemy or a rival. They had become something else entirely. A ghost of memory. A distant echo from a forgotten time. A footnote in old manuscripts barely read. Their story had dissolved into silence. The land that once bore their name was now simply Tuscany, and its secrets lay dormant beneath vineyards and olive groves, buried under layers of time and forgetfulness. For nearly 1,000 years, silence reigned. Then in the 15th century, a spark reignited in Italy itself. It was the Renaissance. A new age of rediscovery emerged, driven by scholars, artists, and wealthy patrons with an insatiable hunger for the lost grandeur of Greece and Rome. Statues were unearthed, ancient texts recopied, and a bold attempt was made to reconstruct the majesty of antiquity. It was during this fervent search for Roman heritage that the Etruscans were quite by accident awakened. Their rediscovery didn't begin in dusty libraries, but in the fields. Tuscan farmers, while tilling the soil, or noblemen digging foundations for grand villas, would occasionally break through the earth and strike stone vaults hidden beneath. Peering into these voids, they didn't find ruins. They found carved chambers, often with walls painted in shockingly vivid colors. Imagine the astonishment of a 15th-century farmer shining his torch into a tomb in Tarquinia and seeing scenes no one in his time had ever witnessed. Men and women joyously feasting, musicians playing double flutes, dancers frozen mid-motion. These images were unlike anything the somber religious art of the Middle Ages had prepared them for. First, these discoveries were misunderstood. Some thought they were Roman or perhaps remnants of some forgotten Greek outpost. The name Etruscan still floated in the writings of Livy and Pliny, but no one knew what their material culture actually looked like. The Etruscans were a people with no face. But as more tombs were uncovered along with bronze artifacts, glossy black Barrero pottery and inscriptions written in a strange alphabet, some scholars began to realize they were seeing something different. This was not Greek. This was not Roman. This was a lost civilization. By the 17th and 18th centuries, this curiosity exploded into a full-blown aristocratic obsession known as Etruscaria. Wealthy collectors such as the Medici Grand Dukes of Florence began to hunt and display Etruscan artifacts. The bronze masterpiece Chimera of Arezzo, discovered in 1553, became a symbol of Tuscan's mysterious and glorious past. The Etruscans were romanticized as keepers of ancient secrets, masters of art, ritual, and perhaps even magic, though sometimes lacking scientific rigor. This enthusiasm laid the foundation for a new discipline, etc. Scholars like Luigi Lancensi in the late 18th century began cataloging and studying artifacts systematically, working to distinguish Etruscan art from Greek influence and attempting the earliest efforts to decode the Etruscan language. The excavation had begun. After a millennium of silence, the Etruscans had begun to speak again. Not with voices, but through images, objects, and the traces they had left deep in the earth. Their second life, a life of memory and archaeology, had finally begun. When history falls silent, the earth begins to speak, not with words, but with traces, not with stories, but with fragments, shards of pottery, crumbling walls, foundations buried beneath moss and centuries. If the Renaissance cracked open the door to the Etruscan world through curiosity and wonder, it was modern archaeology with its science, rigor, and patience that lit the lamp and began to shine it into the deepest corners of that lost civilization. Today, the work of the archaeologist is no longer a treasure hunt like that of the 18th century collectors. Their goal isn't to find beautiful objects to display behind glass. It's to reconstruct the full context of a people's life. They know that a broken pot found where it was last used is worth more than a golden vase pried from its tomb. Because context is the story. For centuries, our knowledge of the Etruscans came almost entirely from their tombs. This skewed the image, making them seem like a people obsessed with death. But modern archaeologists have worked to change that. They turned their attention to the cities of the living. Excavations at sites like Mazzabatoto and Aquaresa revealed complex urban planning. Streets laid out at right angles. Neighborhoods. Public squares. For the first time, we began to see their daily life. Not just the ceremonies of the dead. Technology became an indispensable ally, allowing archaeologists to see beneath the ground without turning a single spade. Aerial photography and satellite imagery detect subtle traces of ancient structures where soil compressions or discoloration reveal buried walls and roads. Geophysical methods like ground-penetrating radar map out three-dimensional structures hidden underground, pinpointing tombs and foundations without disturbing the surface. Biological and chemical analyses of human remains offer insights into diet, disease, and even geographic origins. Vital clues in the debate over whether the Etruscans were indigenous or migrants. The archaeologist's lamp doesn't just illuminate murals. It lights up the blank spaces in the written record. Each artifact recovered is a quiet rebuttal to the silence left by Roman historians. These objects prove that what was forgotten wasn't unimportant. It was once a threat to the version of history that prevailed. The richness, elegance, and uniqueness of Etruscan art and craft weren't accidents. They are evidence of a civilization that once lived boldly, confidently, and with its own voice. That memory wasn't lost. It was overwritten. Still, this work is like piecing together a vast puzzle with most of its parts missing. Each discovery raises more questions than answers. What does a symbol on a bronze mirror mean? What was the purpose of a newly uncovered building? How was a ritual depicted on a tomb wall actually performed? With no long texts to guide them, archaeologists must rely on inference, comparison, and intuition. Yet, every recovered fragment is precious. It is a word spoken after millennia of silence. The archaeologist's task becomes a sacred trust to listen for the whispers beneath the soil, to piece together the shattered memory of a world that was deliberately dismantled, and to return a voice to those who were robbed of theirs. They remind us that some stories, no matter how deeply buried, will find a way back to the surface. Not to accuse, but to be heard. Archaeologists have restored the Etruscans' physical form. They have pulled their cities, their artwork, and their rituals out from the shadows of the earth. But one final door remains closed. One last stronghold of Etruscan identity that even the light of modern science has yet to fully penetrate. It is their language. If we ever hope to truly hear the Etruscans speak, not through their art, not through the silence of stone, but in their own words, we must first break this code. And that code remains one of the most difficult challenges in the entire field of historical linguistics. As mentioned before, it is a language isolate. It has no close relatives, no linguistic cousins to compare against. Unlike how ancient Greek helps illuminate Latin, the cruel irony is this: we can read it. Their alphabet adapted from Greek is largely deciphered. We know the sounds most of their letters represent. We can pronounce the words carved into tombstones. El Veil, and rather. But saying a word aloud and understanding what it means are two entirely different things. Decades of painstaking effort have yielded small fragile victories. By comparing thousands of shorterary inscriptions which tend to follow repeated formulas, scholars have identified around 200 to 300 basic words. We now recognize family terms like clan, son, sissy, daughter, puya, wife, and verbs like turdy, gave, offered. But this limited vocabulary is a skeleton. We still lack the flesh of complex thoughts of philosophy, of myth. The greatest hope lies in the rare longer texts, especially bilingual ones. The Pergi gold tablets discovered in 1964 at an ancient temple site. These are perhaps the most important Etruscan find of the 20th century. 3 thin sheets of gold, 2 in Etruscan, 1 in Phoenician, commemorate a temple dedication to the goddess Uni, linked with the Phoenician estate. This is as close as we've come to a Rosetta Stone for Etruscan. It confirmed a few keywords and offered a glimpse into syntax. But the Etruscan version is longer, and not a direct word-for-word translation of the Phoenician, making it useful but not a universal key. The Linen Book of Zagreb, Liberius Zagrensis, the longest surviving Etruscan text containing about 200 words. Its survival story is almost unbelievable. It had been cut into strips and repurposed as wrappings for an Egyptian mummy during the Ptolemaic era. The text appears to be a religious calendar listing dates and rituals for various gods. Yet without a broader vocabulary, scholars can only speculate about its spiritual meaning. The Cortona bronze tablet, Tabular Cortonensis, found in 1992. This bronze inscription seems to record a legal contract, perhaps about land ownership or rental. It offers new vocabulary relating to law and property, but it is dense, full of technical terms we can't yet interpret. The Etruscan language remains their final frontier. It is the one thing Rome could not absorb, assimilate, or overwrite because it was simply too alien. It stands there silent and immovable like a final monument to their difference. Unlocking it would be more than a linguistic achievement. It would be like receiving a message directly from the dead. A civilization finally able to tell its own story in its own words. But until that day, in the most vital domain of all, silence endures. When archaeology falls short and language remains a locked cipher, modern science turns to a different kind of text. One not written in ink or carved in stone, but encoded in the double helix of life itself, DNA. In recent decades, geneticists have embarked on an ambitious quest, hoping that by analyzing the ancient remains buried deep within Etruscan tombs, they might finally answer a question that has lingered for more than 2,000 years. Where did the Etruscans really come from? The ancient debate between Herodotus, who believed the Etruscans were migrants from Anatolia, and Dionysius of Hyrcanus, who claimed they were native to Italy, has now been carried into the laboratory. By extracting ancient DNA, DNA from the bones and teeth of long-dead Etruscans, scientists have been able to compare their genetic profiles to other ancient and modern populations across Europe and the Near East. The earliest and most consistent results revealed something remarkable: a strong genetic continuity between ancient Etruscans and today's inhabitants of Tuscany and Lazio, the very heartland of ancient Etruria. This confirms without ambiguity that the Etruscans never truly disappeared in a biological sense. They were not replaced by the Romans. Their blood still flows in the veins of modern Italians, farmers, teachers, and bureaucrats alike. This discovery introduces a deep paradox. If their descendants are still here, Why was their cultural memory so completely erased? It is a stark reminder of the difference between genetic heritage and cultural legacy. Genes can be passed down silently. Language, religion, stories, those must be intentionally preserved. Without conscious effort, they vanish. But the larger question remains. What about their origin? Does DNA vindicate Herodotus or Dionysius? Early mitochondrial DNA studies tracing maternal ancestry among modern Tuscans hinted at possible links to the Near East, fueling excitement that Herodotus may have been right. However, more comprehensive and decisive studies in recent years using full genomes extracted directly from ancient Etruscan skeletons tell a different story. A landmark study published in 2021 analyzed DNA from over 80 individuals buried across it, covering a time span of 800 years. Its findings significantly clarified the picture. Etruscan genomes showed overwhelmingly local ancestry. They closely resembled the genetic profiles of Italic-speaking peoples living in other parts of the peninsula, including the Latins of early Rome. There was no evidence of a recent large-scale migration from Anatolia. The genetic verdict is in Dionysius was right. The Etruscans were not mysterious outsiders. They were native Italians, kin to the very Romans who would one day conquer them. So, how do we explain their unique language and culture? The prevailing hypothesis, now bolstered by genetic evidence, is that the Etruscan language was not imported, but a survivor. It may have been a remnant of the pre-Indo-European linguistic landscape that once spanned Europe, an ancient thread that, unlike in most regions, was never fully cut in it. While Indo-European languages like Latin and Greek swept across the continent, replacing older tongues, one of those ancient voices endured a little longer in the hills of Tuscany. The ghost in the blood has spoken, and it tells a story of deep native roots in the Italian soil. Far from making the Etruscans less mysterious, this revelation makes them all the more extraordinary. It shifts the question from where did they come from to how did a people so closely related to the Romans by blood craft such a distinct culture? And why did history erase them so completely? It is no longer a mystery of origin. It is a mystery of eretia. When a people can no longer be spoken of, when their name is stripped from culture and memory, the question becomes, where did they go? Where are the Etruscans beneath the layers of Rome, of Greece, and ultimately of Christianity? Strangely enough, the answer may not lie in abandoned ruins or forgotten tombs, but in the very heart of Western spiritual authority, the Vatican, in the marble halls, in the solemn rituals, and in the very symbols deemed sacred by the Roman Church. Echoes of a forgotten civilization still seem to flicker like a buried thread of gold beneath thick brioche. This is not to suggest that the Church is a direct continuation of Etruscan religion. Rather, points to a deeper truth. No belief system rises from a vacuum. When a new spiritual order takes root, it often absorbs, reinterprets, and recloses the symbolic architecture of the faiths that came before it, especially those that have shaped the subconscious landscape of the land itself. Continuity of sacred space. The Vatican Hill where St. Peter's Basilica now stands lies directly adjacent to a major Etruscan necropolis. This is no coincidence. Across Italy, many of the most important churches were built at top former Etruscan or Roman temples, not just for practical reasons like using existing foundations, but because these were already recognized, even unconsciously, as places of power. These were sites where the veil between heaven and earth had long been considered thin. The land itself remembers echoes in symbols of authority. The crosier, the curved staff carried by bishops, symbolizing spiritual shepherding, bears an uncanny resemblance to the lichus, the curved staff of the Etruscan or the priest who interpreted divine signs by watching birds. The lichus was used to mark out sacred space in the sky, the templum where omens could be received. Both staffs draw a line between the sacred and the profane. Both are tools for reading signs, guiding communities and claiming authority over the invisible. The papal tiara, the now retired triple-tiered crown once worn by popes, is a potent symbol. Its 3 levels strongly evoke ancient cosmologies, including that of the Etruscans, who conceived of the universe in 3 realms: heaven, earth, and the underworld. Etruscan high priests were seen as mediators between these realms. The tiara may be a distant echo of this worldview, an unconscious inheritance of symbolic structure rather than doctrine. The role of the mediator. The title Pontifex Maximus, still held by the Pope, originated in pagan Rome. It was once the highest religious office in the Roman Republic, rooted in traditions that likely drew from Etruscan priesthoods. The word pontifex, meaning bridge builder, reflects an ancient role, the one who connects heaven and earth, divine and immortal. This role existed long before Christianity arrived, and its structure remains deeply embedded in Italy's spiritual DNA. Rome absorbed Etruscan gods. Christianity later replaced Rome's pantheon. But the deeper grammar of ritual, of sacred symbolism, of how spiritual power is organized and conveyed, that persisted. The soul of the Etruscans may not lie in any creed, but in what could be called the grammar of the sacred they left behind on the Italian peninsula. A grammar of how architecture guides the spirit, how a symbol encapsulates cosmic order, how space can become sanctified through intention and ritual. They never truly disappeared. Perhaps they simply withdrew into the sediment layers of symbols, into the unspoken structures of spiritual instinct, no longer named, but somehow still felt, not remembered in words, but present in gesture, not shouted, but quietly there, where meaning still breathes beneath ritual silence. After a long journey through tombs, silent scripts, wars, and buried truths, what are we left with? The story of the Etruscans is not just a missing chapter in the textbook of ancient history. It is far more than that. It is a mirror, one that reflects back how we construct our understanding of the past and forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about the nature of history, civilization, and memory itself. Why does their story matter so much even today? Because it forcefully challenges the linear tale of progress we are so often told. History is typically written as a straight line, a relay race from one civilization to the next, each supposedly more advanced than the last. In that story, Rome's victory over the Etruscans is framed as inevitable, the triumph of a superior model, more organized, more disciplined, more powerful. But the Etruscans reveal that there is more than one way to be civilized. They built a rich, complex society without centralized tyranny. They created an art form pulsing with human warmth, not merely as an instrument of state propaganda. They upheld a worldview where humans were part of a cosmos to be listened to, not masters of it. They gave women visibility in public life, something Rome never dared to do. Their defeat was not cultural or intellectual. It was the defeat of a decentralized model at the hands of an imperial war machine. Their story asks us, is the victorious model always the better one? More profoundly, their erasure lays bare the politics of memory. History is not an objective log of events. It is a curated story shaped by those in power. What gets remembered? What is forgotten? and how a people is portrayed. These are all political decisions. The Etruscans are one of the clearest examples of history written by the victors in which the defeated were not only vanquished on the battlefield, but stripped of their identity in the stream of time. Their memory was restructured to serve Rome's self-glorifying narrative. And that perhaps is the story's most urgent lesson for us today. How many other Etruscan stories exist in the world right now? How many indigenous peoples were absorbed by empire, erased by colonialism? How many alternative social models were branded as primitive or barbaric before they were wiped out and forgotten? The Etruscans teach us how to be critical readers of history. They teach us to listen for the silences, to seek out the voices pushed to the margins, and to question the narratives that sound too clean, too complete. In the end, the Etruscans matter because they are a permanent question mark placed beside the bold assertions of official history. They are a reminder that the past is not a fixed monument. It is a battleground of ideas, of ghosts, of echoing voices that still have something to say. To study them is not just to learn about a people long gone. It is to practice listening to the silence of the world we live in now. And so our journey comes to an end. But the story of the Etruscans does not. It cannot end because it never truly had a beginning nor a clear conclusion. It lingers like an unfinished circle, a question suspended in the air of history. We began with an absence, a civilization that seemed to have vanished into thin air. But layer by layer, through the dust of archaeology, the patterns of DNA, the traces of borrowed symbols, we've come to see they never really disappeared. They are everywhere. Their footprints are pressed deep into the foundations of Rome. Their echoes whisper in the rituals of the Vatican. Their blood flows in the veins of modern Italians. They're there in the domes we admire, in the words we speak without knowing their origin, in the very way we arrange space, ritual, and urban life. They are everywhere. And yet they are no one. This is the Etruscans' final and most profound paradox. Their legacy has been absorbed so completely, so seamlessly that it has become invisible like the air we breathe. Their name was stripped away, their stories overwritten, and they became the nameless scaffolding upon which Rome built its monument to itself. They were not simply forgotten. They were written over. And when the new script became too thick, no one remembered the older text beneath. The greatest question that haunts us then is no longer where did they come from. Modern science has in many ways answered that. The real question is, how can a people be forgotten so deliberately and so effectively? How can a teacher be erased from the memory of the very student they once taught? The answer lies in silence. The silence of books never written. The silence of a language no one can read. The silence of Roman historians who chose to look the other way. The silence of centuries where their name was just a strange word in the margins of old manuscripts. And yet perhaps it is in this silence that the Etruscans have found their strongest voice. They do not speak to us through battles or legal codes. They speak through their absence. It is that absence that compels us to look again, to question, to search. They become an eternal lesson in the fragility of memory and the violence of erasure. When you stand on a Tuscan hill at sunset, looking over the green valleys below, know that beneath your feet may lie a lost city, a necropolis filled with murals unseen for thousands of years. When you gaze upon the mysterious smile of the couple carved into their ancient sarcophagus, ask yourself what they might be thinking. They know things we will never know. They do not need us to rebuild their world. Perhaps they only ask that we listen to the silence they left behind, because that silence is not empty. It is full of stories untold, questions unanswered, and a quiet reminder that history is not only what remains, but also everything that was taken away. And that is their final legacy. A silence that speaks,